tell me. Welcome to our webinar, Corporate Social Responsibility, Understanding the Triple Bottom Line. I am Walter Reichman. I am a partner and vice president of a management consulting firm, Org Vitality, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. Corporate culture has changed dramatically since the renowned economist Milton Friedman made the statement that the only social responsibility of business is that they have to use their resources to increase its profit. This cultural change has been loosely termed corporate social responsibility, and to discuss this change and the implications for business, for society, and for all who are involved in it, we have a distinguished panel of experts who are deeply involved in providing and researching corporate social responsibility. Our first person is Michelle Nager. Can we go? Michelle was Vice President of Social Responsibility for Starwood Hotels and Resorts. Her social responsibility efforts included philanthropy, social governance, charitable partnership, disaster responses, and employee engagement programs. Michelle, would you say hello? Okay. Second is Paula Caligari. Paula is the founder and director of the Cultural Agility Leadership Laboratory at Northeastern University, which is a corporate-sponsored international volunteerism program that is in partnership with the National Police Corps. Say hello, Paula, could you? Thank you. And,
I agree with you.
Okay, great. And Frances Milliken is the Arthur E. Imperatori Professor of Entrepreneurial Studies at the Stern School of Business of New York University. And then we have Chelsea Wilness, who is Associate Dean of Research and Academics and the Grandy Scholar of Sustainable Leadership at the Edwards School of Business at the University of Saskatchewan. Hello, Chelsea. Great.
Hi.
Before we get into the substance of the program, I want to introduce Professor Deborah Rupp. Deborah actually wrote the NSF grant which gave rise to the CSR Summit at SIOP last year, and by remote control to this webinar. And Deborah is the William C. Byam Chair in Industrial and Organizational Psychology and is the Research Integrity Officer at Purdue University. Deborah, would you make your announcement and take it away from here?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Walter. Thanks all of you for attending. This webinar is just a really wonderful follow-up activity to the NSF-funded summit held at the SIOP conference last year. That was just a terrific event, and for those of you who weren't able to attend, just about all of the presentations have been posted to the CSR Summit website. That's provided here on the slide that's showing, and I believe that Org Vitality will be sending out this slide to all of you following the webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our wonderful panel today, but before they begin, I just want to let you know about a few opportunities coming up that you can be a part of. The first is a networking reception at this year's SIOP conference in Orlando, Florida. It will take place Wednesday evening, that's April 26th from 5 to 7 in the Southern Hemisphere 5 room. That's the 5th floor of the Dolphin Hotel. The summit speakers will be there. Hopefully today's speakers will be there, and we'd love to see you all there as well. Secondly, you're all invited to join the Micro CSR LinkedIn group page. This is hosted by Chelsea Wellness and her colleagues. The URL is provided here and can easily be found within LinkedIn as well. So we encourage you to join this group. Finally, just announcing again our coming soon SIOP-sponsored CSR registry. This is a web-based tool within which individuals can be identified for their particular areas of expertise in CSR, both science and practice. And so we'll be continuing to send out more information about that. At the reception at SIOP, I'll be seeking your input on keywords and search terms. So that will be launched hopefully by mid-year, soon after SIOP. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you Org Vitality for hosting this event, and I'll turn things over back to Walter to moderate this great session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the work and all your efforts on this, Deborah. As we get into it, let's start with a definition. We hear the word CSR being talked about all over the place. Different companies have CSR. There are different organizations dealing with corporate social responsibility. There is even, I learned just the other day, an organization in Japan that monitors corporate social responsibility in Japan. My question is, when we use the term corporate social responsibility, are we all talking about the same thing? Is there a definition of corporate social responsibility? And if so, what is that? Chelsea, could we start with you on this, please?
Sure thing, Walter. And in fact, I really like the way you've positioned the question, is there sort of one thing and are we all talking about the same thing? I think a really important observation is that there's actually a lot of terms that might be used interchangeably when we talk about a concept like this. So it might even include things like corporate sustainability. We might hear about corporate social performance or corporate citizenship. And there are differences in those things, of course, but a lot of the time, you know, it may mean the same thing to some people. And so there's a lot of different definitions that might be used, and one thing we all agree on is that there's not necessarily one definition. So what I thought I might do is actually touch on sort of some common elements that can be pulled from a lot of different conceptualizations, and I think that that might give a good understanding of what CSR is all about rather than sort of one specific definition, although we can kind of return to that in a minute or so. And so some of those common elements, one would be the triple bottom line idea, and so that's, again, even just in the title of today's session, and that idea is that there's sort of a simultaneous consideration or focus on the economic, social, and environmental aspects of an organization's performance and their activities. And another way to think about this is the idea of people, planet, and profit. So all of those things sort of considered simultaneously, and that they're all important to the organization. Another important element, I think, of thinking about CSR is this idea of it being discretionary practices or activities. So rather than compliance with legal requirements, for instance, many people might conceptualize social responsibility as something that's over and above that, so that the organization doesn't have to do it legally, and they're electing to engage in these particular practices, so that it's discretionary and something that's by choice. And there's often considerations of multiple stakeholders, so that might be employees, customers, the natural environment, the communities in which the organization does business, supply chain, investors, any variety of different stakeholders can be considered in a broader definition. And lastly, there might be multiple dimensions of CSR. So I alluded to the idea of community. Other people might focus on the natural environment, perhaps ideas of what we might think about as internal CSR, so employee treatment or diversity practices and those kinds of things. So multiple ways of looking at this particular construct. So to bring all that kind of together, you know, it's not necessarily just about corporate philanthropy, which I think sometimes folks might land on, you know, is it just about giving money to something that the company does that? And of course, there's value in that, in donating to certain causes, but it's really so much more. So it might be reduction of carbon emissions, again, beyond what's required, you know, reducing energy use in terms of those environmental dimensions, or it might be involvement in the community, like a volunteerism program that engages employees as well, or maybe it's over and above family-friendly practices in terms of extended parental benefits or something like that. So that's, and I'll invite my colleagues on the panel as well to jump in for anything that I've missed, but sort of discretionary, triple bottom line, consideration of multiple stakeholders in the organization's environment.
Very great. To Chelsea and to other members of the panel, what accounts for the fact that CSR has become so popular? There's books been written about it. There are meetings being held in the last 15 or 20 years. What do you think accounts for this change from the days of Milton Friedman's statement? What would you say?
This is Michelle. I'm happy to jump in on that. I mean, I think part of it is consumer demand and investor demand. There's been a huge rise in that as people start to think further about what they're looking for in a business, especially a consumer goods business or a services business. So there's been a drive from those stakeholders. And I think, I mean, it's interesting, Chelsea, what you said about the discretionary piece. It made me think for a second, because there's definitely a lot of it that's discretionary, but I do think that part of the requirements weren't always requirements, and so that was kind of part of the genesis of CSR as a corporate function, is parts of it that ultimately there was a realization that they should be requirements, but they weren't initially, and so thinking about those elements, baking those into the business, and then ultimately that led to certain regulations being put in place, certain practices that became a requirement, and then going above and beyond that to say, okay, what comes next?
Mm-hmm.
So corporate social responsibility, as determined by business organizations, actually drove part of this cultural change in business throughout our society. Very nice. Michelle, I'm sorry, go ahead, Paula.
We're also creating a tighter link between corporate reputation and the bottom line of the organization. So things that are helping corporate social responsibility are in fact helping corporate reputation, and those are helping the bottom line of the firm. So.
Great, great. I want to go back to Michelle. Michelle, you ran a corporate social responsibility program for Starwood Hotels and Resorts. Two questions. How did Starwood get involved? What made them get involved in this? And then if you could share one of the programs that you monitored for Starwood Hotels. I'm primarily thinking the one on trafficking, but let me try to you, Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So, I mean, I think like a lot of companies, we started out, before we had a formal CSR program, we started out with components of what would be considered part of that platform, such as charitable giving program for local giving and an environmental focus. But creating a dedicated CSR department really started with focus from the top. You know, it had to come from the top, and we were very fortunate to have a CEO and an executive leadership team that recognized the relevance and the importance of social responsibility. And I think they also saw, what I mentioned before about the rise in consumer interest and investor interest, not just in what we did as a business, but how we were doing it, how we were going about our operations. So it became more than just a focus on being a good corporate citizen. So when we first created a formalized corporate social responsibility team, we were looking for ways to be more strategic in how we did it. So we started with environmental sustainability as kind of our first step, and established reduction goals across our entire system, looking for ways to make our operations more efficient and environmentally friendly. And then as we grew, we continued to expand our focus to think differently about our approach on the social side. So how do we invest in people and in our communities in a more strategic way? So we were looking for ways to direct philanthropic resources for long-term growth and development in the communities where we operate around the world. And this led to things like improved access to opportunities for our associates, our employees, to engage in a volunteer capacity, strategic NGO relationships, so that we can understand and share the knowledge and experience that we have to benefit others. The reference that you made to human rights and human trafficking is one of our key focus areas, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. It's something that, human rights has been a focus area for Starwood in general, and we've also, across the entire hotel industry, recognized the need to address human trafficking throughout operations. It's something that, you start with some awareness raising about the issue, about trafficking and how it's relevant to our business. For example, the potential for sex traffickers to utilize hotels to conduct their business. It's a horrific crime, and it's a very sensitive topic, so we started with internal training for our employees to help them understand the issue, how to recognize signs of potential trafficking, and how to report any suspicious activity to appropriate authorities. And then in addition to the training, we provide tools to support our hotel teams and work closely across our peers in the industry. For example, We incorporated our human rights policy and our reporting structure into our global ethics training, into our security briefings. We issued a public industry-wide position statement through a group called the International Tourism Partnership. So really looking for ways to hit it at every angle, internally and externally. It's hard to measure the impact of something like that. It's easy to measure number of people trained, for example, but what's more valuable and unfortunately across everything with CSR more challenging is to measure the actual impact that you've driven. Just by virtue of raising awareness around an issue like trafficking or any such issue, you expect to see an uptick in the number of reports of potential trafficking, potential issues, because people now are more aware of it. They've been trained, they're looking for it. But you can't always determine how many of those reports are actually validated in the end, because you turn those cases over to the authorities and you don't necessarily know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. So from a qualitative level, we've seen some great feedback from employees, just being grateful to understand the issue and being given the tools they need. But it's something that's a constant process to get better at our evaluation.
Terrific. The two things that you said that stand out, one, it has to start at the top of the corporation. So probably the way to promote CSR would be to have activities to direct kinds of information and process to CEOs and presidents of organizations and companies. And the second thing that you said that I think is extremely interesting is the notion that it is so difficult to determine the effect of the CSR directly, that maybe one of the things researchers will be able to do eventually is to refine better measurements for evaluating the outcome of CSR. And that's not to say anything negative against the kind of information that you get from qualitative data and qualitative research. So you certainly have had an impact. And I think I'm very happy for you to talk about that. Paula, you won a very interesting program as well, a slightly different type of a program where you focus on volunteers. With Michelle said they also had volunteers there, but you have a program directed at volunteers, and you have some very interesting programs with GlaxoSmithKline. Could you tell us about your volunteer program and how it's used by GlaxoSmithKline as an example?
Sure. So our specific program is a joint venture between Northeastern University and the National Peace Corps Association. The idea behind the program is that we're a solution for companies that are interested in having international corporate volunteerism programs. So those, in sort of the simplest phrases, they're pro bono advisor programs where companies like Starwoods would send their skilled professionals to help solve a specific problem in an NGO, something that's demand-driven, community-driven. The Peace Corps has identified that the Peace Corps helps us vet in terms of that key important project, that we would go back to a company like a Starwoods or Cigna or some of the other companies that we're working with to say, do you have some experts who could help us out with this? What's interesting about these programs, they're being used currently by about 10 to 15% of Fortune 500 firms. A lot of these came online right at about the time of the recession, when companies were saying, look, we can't really afford to give money right now or gifts, but what we can do is we can give something more valuable. We can give the talents of our people. So what we're seeing, though, is because CSR has really taken hold in many of these organizations, we're seeing an increase of firms wanting to do this. The other very, very exciting trend about this is that what we're finding from both a research perspective as well as the practice of this is that when these programs are designed very well, the needle moves for everyone. So we're seeing that when the program is designed that's community-driven, need-driven, we're not painting buildings or planting gardens, but they're solving a problem specific to the NGO that's sustainable, the needle moves for the NGO. We're finding that when we develop the volunteerism programs that allows our professionals to use their skills, whether they're accounting, supply chain, IT, whatever they may be, engineering, that when they use those skills in a novel context, the needle's moving on their cultural agility. What we're finding is that when they're in a market and they can identify the market in the area that they want to serve, when they're working in a part of the world that it's a market they're interested in going into or need to get a little smarter about, innovation is coming back into the organization. So what's very exciting about these programs is that it's a win-win-win for companies, for individuals, for the nonprofits and the NGOs that they're serving. So it's a very, very exciting initiative. I think what we're seeing now is that companies are deciding best how to use those programs. So in some cases, again, with the idea that a lot of this is switching over from almost a CSR hat to an HR hat, it's how do you want to best use those programs? So in some cases, you could say, you know what, this is going to be an employee engagement initiative. We're going to open it up to all of our, like GlaxoSmithKline has done. We're going to open up to any associate who wants to apply as long as they've been here for 5 years. They passed the assessment hurdles. Their supervisor says it's okay for them to engage in one of these volunteerism projects. They can open it up, they can apply, they can compete, and it actually has a nice boost for employee engagement because it's broad. Other firms like the PepsiCos, Cignas, Dow's, they're using these programs in a very targeted way. They're saying, okay, we have maybe a group of individuals who can apply, or I'm most familiar with Cigna. In this case, it's a specific group of individuals who are participating in global leadership development programs, and those individuals are convened and placed into another country for some NGO work. So it's really interesting if the primary focus within HR is engagement, companies set them up in one way. If the primary focus is leadership development, they'll set them up in another way. I'm personally very excited about this because I see it as a really nice link between CSR and HR. It's a new marriage.
Very nice. So basically you serve two purposes. You develop people inside the company to become leaders within the company, to be innovative within their own company, and they develop these skills actually by serving some need somewhere else, helping another group of people in another part of the world. So it's almost a management training process as well, as it is a social responsibility kind of activity.
Absolutely. When designed well, there's two caveats on this because the research is also there. When these experiences are designed well, if they're not designed well, they're fantastic, but they're feel-good experiences. They're not developmental opportunities. The other thing that we're finding is that pre-assessment matters. If we put someone in an experience too novel and they're not ready for it, their cross-cultural competencies actually go down. But we see when we put people in those experiences that they are ready for, their cross-cultural competencies go up. So those would be my two caveats.
It's not a haphazard process. It is a process that has to be very well thought through, very well planned, where you have to look at the potential negative consequences of doing things incorrectly, and then allow for that in the planning. Do they have tryouts on this? Do they try it in a small way and see if it works and then decide to enlarge it after that, or do they tend to go at it wholeheartedly?
Right. So, well, answered a couple of different ways. Companies like GlaxoSmithKline you had mentioned, they have opportunities where individuals can volunteer domestically. So whatever their home country is, they can work in a domestic context. And what we're finding from the data is that for those whose cross-cultural competencies are a bit lower, actually the novelty of being in that nonprofit organization is enough to help build cross-cultural competencies. In other words, we're creating, or at least the research is suggesting, we create the experience that the individual is ready for in order for them to build their competencies. The other thing, when they're those lockstep programs, when we know exactly who we need to be sending on those into those NGOs, what we do is we put our Peace Corps, our return Peace Corps volunteers in as cultural coaches, and they can buffer some of the more extreme challenges that they might face. And so every day they're really thinking through what went right, what didn't, what could we do better, and they have a bit of a safety net there.
So it's a difficult process. It's not an easy process.
Very.
You
That's why we work in the Peace Corps.
You have to monitor it as it goes through and be aware that things may need changes after you've begun the process.
And yes, it takes a while.
Frances, picking up on some of the things that Paula said, you've done an enormous amount of research on the success and what makes for success within CSR programs. My broad question to you, and then you'll take it apart and give us the real data on it. To what extent are CSR programs effective for the organization who is starting that program, who's working on that program? And what do they have to do? Got some of this from what Paula said, but I think there's more to it as well. What does a company have to do to make the CSR work for them, for it to be able to promote their organization and their profits?
Well, thanks, Walter. That is the $64,000 question, right? So you originally asked me, do all CSR programs always work for the companies that start those programs? And the short answer to that question is no. CSR programs do not always work for companies. And I think the companies that are most at risk of having their CSR programs backfire are those that oversell what they do. When the public or the employees feel that a company seems to be self-promoting but is not really serious in its CSR efforts, there can be a backlash, and employees and the public can become cynical about that company's efforts. And that can set a firm back. That can actually harm a firm's reputation and decrease the trust that employees, investors, and the public have in a firm. And once lost, trust is very hard to reclaim, as we know from our studies in psychology. So to answer the second part of the question, what does it take to make CSR programs successful? So my initial response to that is to capture the imagination of the workforce is a critical component of making a CSR program successful. But let me also give you an answer that is based on some work I've been doing with benchmarking CSR programs against each other. And one of the things I feel like we're observing from this research is that you really need to have both top-down and bottom-up approaches to CSR sustainability. So the top-down, examples would be Pepsi or Unilever, where the CEO is constantly talking about CSR, or J&J, where it's very clear that CSR is the focus of the company. But beyond that, not just in terms of articulating the values of CSR, you also have to have the systems and programs in place that support what you hope will be some really exciting employee initiatives. And those often have to be top-down, like, for example, making the decision to have a CSR officer or a chief sustainability officer. That has to be decided at the top. But I also feel that you also have to have bottom-up energy and bottom-up sort of excitement about CSR programs and the opportunity for employees to contribute ideas, to try to figure out how to help the firm improve its CSR performance. To me, those types of programs are highly likely to create an engaged workforce. But then again, they're insufficient in the sense that you need the top-down focus as well in order to create the systems to make those ideas actually work for the organization and diffuse both up the hierarchy and laterally throughout the organization. So that's my, my quick answer to your question.
What should an organization in fact do to get their people involved in this, to get the, what should the top do to get the bottom involved?
Well, one program, you know, that I've seen that's pretty successful is to have various different ways of creating teams around CSR sustainability issues. It could be created around sites in an organization. It could be created around issues, for example, around trafficking, as in Michelle's case, or around water usage, or around energy usage, or, you know, whatever the employees are interested in participating in. And having those teams sort of get together and brainstorm and think about the issues and like how could we help our organization increase its performance on whatever that issue is or in this particular site.
Okay, great, great.
Walter, if I can just add something to what Francis just said, I think that last piece is really key about getting input from all of your employees. You know, it's very easy to set from the top and say, this is our strategy, these are the areas we think we need to focus on because of our business model. But if you don't talk to people, you know, listen, really listen to what it is that they care about, it's hard to engage people in a cause that you care about if it's not something that they believe in, or if you have another cause that's of interest to them. So I think the listening part and getting feedback from people and really developing a program where their interests and needs are matched just as much as the businesses is important.
Okay, very, very, very good. I'm wondering, what about the other end of it? The people that you're trying to serve through the CSR, to what extent are the programs successful in making life better, improving, doing something positive for the targets of the CSR program? Anyone? Yeah, Francis?
I think that goes back to the issue we sort of discussed earlier, how difficult it is to measure the performance of CSR programs. Even in your question of, you know, what makes it a CSR program successful, you really have to define what you mean by success. Mm-hmm. Like, what are the metrics that you're going to be looking at? And, you know, a short answer to that question, I would say, would be they're externally focused metrics and they're internally focused metrics. And so, for example, doing well on something like Bloomberg's ESG assessment is a good indicator sort of that, an externally focused CSR assessment. And doing employee surveys on the impact on employee engagement and involvement in CSR would be a good way of tracking sort of internally inside an organization. Is there a payoff amongst the employees? But organizations have multiple stakeholders. This is a complicated question. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I know a lot of, I think Michelle mentioned before the idea of awareness of CSR programs is something that lots of companies track, but clearly that's insufficient.
Yeah. And I think to your question, Walter, about the recipients, so when you think about all of these programs are designed to help the community, they're helped to try to address some social need in the community. You know, from the business perspective, it's working with the nonprofit partners to understand what it is that they're measuring. And there's a lot of discussion around the difference between measuring an outcome versus measuring an impact. The outcomes are easy. You can say how many people were trained, how many people went to a program, right? It's harder to measure, okay, they went to your training, but did it transform their lives? Did they, if they went to a job skills training, did they get a job? Were they able to keep that job? How long could they keep that job? You know, so looking beyond just the initial measures, and I think that's where the field has been shifting over the last couple of years, is how do you really know that what you're doing and where you're putting your time and money is actually impacting society in a positive way?
Okay. Yeah. Paula?
Actually, say one more quick point. Sorry, I'll only just give a second.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think there's a really critical point before anything is started. So I like the way you phrased the question as well earlier around if a company is thinking about starting this type of initiative. And I think that there's a little bit of homework in terms of defining something that can be mutually beneficial right from the get-go. So in order to understand what are the impacts, what are the outcomes, I think we need to understand what's the problem we're trying to solve in the first place and who has voice in that process. And so I would caution companies against just sort of, dropping down and saying, oh, well, we're going to fix this and help this and try to almost paternalistically try to fix something that we don't fully understand. And I think that can be very misguided. Whereas having some kind of stakeholder consultation, some kind of voice in that process where you have employees engaged right from the get-go, where you have community members of the NGO you're partnering with, whatever it is, to sort of collaboratively define what is it that we're working on together so that it's mutually beneficial. And I think that what happens then in the end is not just being able to understand and monitor and measure the outcomes because we know what the problem is in the first place. That also speaks to that cynicism on the part of external observers of that process, where I look at that whole thing and I say, they're doing it for real. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. They've really well defined and thought out that program, and it's very authentic. And so I think that there's all kinds of additional or peripheral benefits that happen from that type of approach. It takes a lot more time, it takes more resources potentially to define all of that, but I think that that's where you really get a genuine impact on a lot of levels, including for the organization.
Great, great. What comes to mind, I'm wondering, to what extent should the CSR project be related to the goals or the product of the organization that's instituting it? Does there have to be a relationship, or does it not matter? Your thoughts?
Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, well, thanks. So, well, you're telling it's two ways to answer it, right? You're telling a public story in that you're a company that stands for healthcare or clean water or whatever, and that should be reflective of the industry that you're in or the industry that you're competing in. But I guess from my lens, I look at what's the depth of skills that are available depending on what the issue is that the nonprofits are requesting. And I couldn't agree with you more, Chelsea. It has to be community-driven, demand-driven, or this is just, it's really, you're just doing it for the sake of PR, and that's not okay. So I would say, yeah, it has to be I would recommend a tighter link between how is your organization, what do they believe themselves to be experts in, and how are they trying to contribute to the world, and what are they contributing to the communities.
I think another factor to that is the longevity of your program. You don't want it to be based on the current senior leadership team and the individuals and what they care about. You want it to be based on the business and the vision and the objectives of that business so that it stays and grows with the business over time. So the goals the business has align with the goals of what your CSR program is, and it's embedded together and continues to grow together.
Okay. Very nice.
I was going to say that one of the distinctions that I've seen in the CSR literature is between what's called embedded and peripheral CSR, which is a distinction that Ante Glavis and Herman Aquinas have made. And the idea of embedded CSR is that the CSR is integral to the strategy of the company and incorporated into the day-to-day experiences of employees if possible. And then peripheral programs are those that involve an activity but are not framed in such a way as to be seen by the employees as integral to the company. The evidence seems to suggest that you get, more sustainable employee engagement from having what they call embedded CSR programs. So that makes employees feel, I think, that the CSR is more authentic when it's being brought back into the organization and it's seen as being a part of sort of the routines of the organization.
Yeah, and I would guess they would see it more authentic in terms of their own work, that what they're doing as part of CSR is also promoting their own ability within their organization to be successful and to fulfill the needs of the organization. Very nice. Now, what comes to mind now is what happens when CSR goes sour. We've heard the term greenwashing, and we know what happened with Volkswagen just a short time ago. Chelsea, what happens when things go sour with CSR?
Sure. I think it's really important to consider that. And I guess I would start by saying that there's a lot of evidence being accumulated that CSR has really positive impact. So again, we've talked about things like employee engagement. There's a longer actually literature in consumer behavior suggesting that there's a lot of good things that happen through organizations engaging in CSR in any variety of ways. But less attention to something that's sort of only now coming to the forefront where, yeah, it doesn't always go super well, and there can be lots of reasons for that. And the Volkswagen is a sort of a really extreme example where they were actually cheating on emissions tests. So just to remind everybody about sort of what happened is you know, the BBC has called it the diesel dupe, which I think is so funny, but they had actually consciously installed mechanisms in their vehicles to cheat on emissions tests. They could actually detect when they were being tested and adjust the performance to look better. I mean, there's layers of all kinds of ickiness there, right? And so in terms of fallout, I mean, it was millions and millions of vehicles worldwide that were recalled, and perhaps even more importantly in terms of the fallout from that would be, again, reputational damage, you know, investor decisions, purchasing decisions for the future. Who knows how long that's gonna last in terms of them having to recover that reputational damage and just sales problems, right? So what I think is really important to think about though is on the less extreme level. So this is like blatantly cheating and a crazy elaborate scheme almost that anybody would see as a very negative company practice. They followed it up by all kinds of finger pointing and trying to say, oh yeah, these 2 frontline engineers were responsible for all of it, which of course nobody believed. But I think that even in a less extreme example, you can have an organization who that is engaging in quite a genuine effort at CSR, and it could still be perceived negatively for any number of reasons. And I think really understanding more about that is important. And it can be just when people don't trust the motives. So I really liked the question about, does the CSR initiative have to match the company's strategy or the company's industry? Not necessarily always, but people tend to respond more positively when there's a link there, when it's clear that it's embedded, as Francis was talking about, or where the company and the cause match, which is sort of how it's described in consumer behavior. So lots of different reasons why it might not be perceived positively, and some of the work that myself and some colleagues are doing is around that motives idea. So why are they doing that? I don't quite trust it. And then trying to help organizations not engage in that overselling or over-promoting, but really speaking about their initiatives in a really genuine way to avoid those perceptions. So I'm kind of more concerned about even when they're doing things right and it's not seen positively, that can be a real problem. So, so yeah, really being deliberate about the communication efforts and that authenticity, engagement with the community, quite legitimately engagement with employees, and I think that can go over a lot better.
So the eyes of the beholder play a very important role in the success of the CSR program, and so part of the CSR program ought to be to promote so that the beholders see it in a positive way. And certainly they can't do that if in fact it isn't a positive way, but even if it is, somehow you've got to take steps to convince people that it is genuine and that you're really involved.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and if I can actually come back to something that I think that Michelle said earlier when we were talking about the definitions, there's that kind of ratcheting expectation a little bit now. So the field, both on the organization standpoint and the research standpoint, is moving pretty quickly. And so things that might have been, you know, really innovative and discretionary way back when are now expected. And so I think that plays somewhat of a role as well, where we as consumers or say job seekers or employees or whomever, we're kind of bombarded by these messages from all kinds of organizations that, you know, we're green, we're this, we're that, and we start to kind of put up some barriers to that communication. So it's also breaking through that noise and being really careful about the communication strategy in terms of, again, that authenticity piece. But the landscape is changing really quickly, or, you know, sort of the context in which that communication takes place. So I think that's important to raise as well.
And are you saying, yeah, I'm sorry, Deborah, please.
I just wanted to say, you know, for any graduate students who might be listening in, there's some real research opportunities in this area, specifically differentiating between corporate, you know, refraining from corporate irresponsibility and engaging in corporate social responsibility. Refraining from doing bad and doing good are different things. The justice literature has dealt with this a little bit. Justice, fairness versus unfairness, justice versus injustice. And there's a small amount of research accumulating on this topic now, but we certainly need more. So please do your theses and dissertations on this topic. Michelle?
One other piece I would add to that is in the response. So I mean, Chelsea makes a good point, right? It's usually the smaller instances that are the more challenging ones, because you have companies who are trying to do the right thing, but something may come up. And I think how a company responds to that is part of where you continue to build that connection with the consumer and the authenticity of your program. It's hard to be transparent on something when it comes up. There's lots of liability issues, and there's concerns about staying conservative and privacy and taking care of things properly, but there is also, for those that are willing to be transparent and say, this is what went wrong, this is how we're trying to fix it, and make it kind of an open communication. I think it'd be interesting to see the research on how far that goes.
Very nice. How does it affect the job market? Do organizations that have good CSR programs, are they in fact attracting more people to their organization? Are they attracting a different set of people to their organizations? What's your thinking on that? It came from Deborah's statement about graduate students. I'm just wondering. Any sense of how that is? An area of research. Okay.
There certainly is a body of research suggesting that this is a differentiator in terms of recruiting, that people do respond positively to potential employers who are making a difference.
Especially among millennials.
Ah, okay. I was wondering whether someone was going to say that. And there goes your cultural differences. I guess along with your age differences as well. And as I'm thinking, it's part of the changing culture of our society that millennials, to a greater extent than others before them, are interested in working in corporations that have CSR. Let's turn a little bit. We have a little bit more time. Let's turn to the future. What can we expect CSR to become, to develop? What has to be done? What is needed? What's going to happen within the next 10 years? One of the things that comes to mind is, should CSR be part of an MBA program? Should we train executives in corporate social responsibility and in success and failures using corporate social responsibility? Should we train, should it be part of PhD programs in industrial organizational psychology? What do you think? Francis, what do you think about that being part of an MBA, being part of an IO PhD program?
That's an easy one. Yes. In fact, an emphatic yes in a business school. And the reason why is because historically, business schools and business have been dominated by the Friedman-esque model of capitalism, which suggested that the only responsibility of companies is to return revenue to the shareholders. And when I teach leadership in organizations here at Stern, I always do a session on CSR and sustainability and the triple bottom line. And my purpose is not to proselytize, but to make sure that students are aware of what I see as this alternate model of capitalism that is developing. And Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, asked the question, do you run business for society or not? And I think clearly we have to answer that question with a yes. We should run business for society. And so then the next question, of course, is what's the best way to run a business for society? And I think engaging in a debate about alternate forms of capitalism in a business school classroom is a really important thing. to do for the next generation.
And Deborah, what would you say about IO psychology PhDs and corporate social responsibility?
I would also say yes, for sure. The field of biopsychology is becoming more and more person-centric, more and more humanitarian, more and more pro-social. And so I think our field plays an important role for understanding, for developing understanding and knowledge around some of the questions that Francis was asking. I want to mention that IO programs now have the opportunity to join the United Nations, to become participants in the United Nations Global Compact, which is a voluntary set of 10 principles around human rights and anti-corruption and very CSR related values, and all that says is that the IO program is going to have, some elements of its curriculum, of its activities that are focused on these more CSR-oriented values, and they become publicly acknowledged for doing so. So I would encourage IO programs to get on board, join the Global Compact. There's a toolkit on the SIOP website making it very, very easy to join. It's not a very labor-intensive process. And then business schools and have the opportunity to join PRIME, which is a sister program to the Global Compact, which involves committing to similar principles in education. So yes, for sure.
Okay, and I think the whole area of humanitarian work psychology is now coming to the forefront as well, and will be a major psychology in probably business schools as well. What's the future of research? Chelsea, what kind of research do we need? You're an advocate of good research. What do we need to do? What kind of programs do we need to do to move this thing forward, to move this whole CSR movement ahead?
Sure, and I'll pick up on a couple of points that my colleagues have already raised today that I think are super valuable as well. So Deborah mentioned sort of the difference between irresponsibility and responsibility, and I think there's still a lot of space to examine how that works. So sort of negative and neutral can sometimes be, or positive and neutral, sorry, can sometimes be perceived similarly. So how does an organization actually sort of leverage their positive practices to do good both for their stakeholders but also for business, so that triple bottom line. Mm-hmm. And then this idea of negative reactions, so I might be a little bit biased because I'm super excited about looking at that angle, but we just haven't really been focusing on it as much. So with that changing landscape and the shifting context and different expectations of our stakeholders, I think that really deserves some more attention in terms of when and why and how do people respond negatively, particularly when an organization is really trying to just do good, right? And the last thing I'd point out, and again I'd open that up to my colleagues for additional suggestions, is what we're calling multi-level research. So I think that speaks back to the question about, is it effective? How do we know? What are the impacts? Right now, some of the research is a little bit contained at different levels. So we might examine how does it affect employees, or how are employees involved? Or we might look at how does it relate to financial performance at the organization level? How does it relate between organizations or within industries, or sort of going up the chain of levels? But there's not a lot that integrates those different levels within the same examination, and that could be very valuable right up to the societal level. So research that can then more so combine levels like that will really, I think, give more insights into when and how and why CSR is effective.
I guess we have to promote CSR research among our doctoral students.
Absolutely.
I can think of, from what you just said, I can think of 7 or 8, off the top of my head, dissertations that very well come out of that.
Yeah, there's a lot that's been done, but an exciting space with a lot left to be done. So you're absolutely right that, those are different perspectives as well, and excited graduate students who can bring some innovation to that, for sure.
Yeah, very, very nice.
One thing I would like to see,
and I would just add to that, there's.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll go ahead.
Okay, go
ahead.
I just
more research on the connection between employee perceptions of CSR and actual programs. I feel like a lot of the micro research, the OB research that I've looked at on CSR uses measures of employee, perceived CSR, and looking at the relationship, let's say, between perceived CSR and employee engagement. And while that's interesting, I would love to see some research that focuses on the relationship between various programs and employee engagement, or even various programs and perceived CSR. So what is it that makes an employee perceive an organization as having really excellent CSR programs, or, to Chelsea's point, having insufficient CSR programs? So I'd like to see more connection between the perception of CSR and the actual implementation of CSR programs.
Very good. Deborah, you were going to say something too. Deborah?
Yeah, well, Margolis and Walsh said over 10 years ago, what we needed. The organizational literature has done a really nice job looking at how, CSR can help firms' bottom lines. But what is really needed, in addition to this, is how successful are CSR initiatives in creating the social good that they're intending to make. So that other stakeholder group, which is those that are served by the CSR initiatives. And we haven't scraped the surface on that. And so I think there is just such rich opportunities in the area of measurement and metrics in terms of how good are we at doing good. So that would be my big plug for new research.
Okay, very nice. Fantastic number of ideas. One last issue, because we're coming down to the last 5 or 6 minutes. What's the relationship between CSR and sustainability? That's another key word that's coming around. The UN has its sustainability, 17 sustainability goals. What's the relationship? Michelle, can you give us some insight into that?
Sure, I'll try. I think, and I forget, someone had said earlier as well, part of it is just how things are defined. I think maybe it was Chelsea that was giving the different definitions of CSR. So, in some cases, I think sustainability is used synonymously with other CSR terms. But if we're looking at the difference between the focus on the social side, community and people side, versus the environmental or planet side, there's definitely different skill sets required in each of those areas. But there's also crossovers between those disciplines. So you may need to have more of a technical background to address some of the sustainability issues from an environmental perspective, but you also need to think about, and I think everyone said this in different ways, you need to think about the impact on the community themselves, the impact on your employees, your customers, how do these things all interplay? They go hand in hand, and it has to be inclusive in order for it to be effective in the long term. Another thing I think we've talked about is the word sustainability is really about longevity, and tying your, as a CSR professional, tying the vision of your CSR program with your business's strategy, in order to ensure that you're focusing on the long-term social impacts and the longevity of your program itself, so that it stays relevant over time. I did want to just touch on, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think they're an interesting framework for businesses. It's been great to see the trajectory of the Millennial Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a bigger focus on the inclusion of business with the SDGs,
yes.
And also collaboration across key stakeholders. So I think still the CSR strategy should be framed around the business that it represents, but the SDGs can help provide some guidance to that approach, a framework, and I think one of the biggest benefits of those goals is that it allows stakeholders from different segments, so business, government, nonprofits, it allows them all to speak the same language and align easily on which focus areas they're trying to address, and then to everyone's comments really about measuring, right? So there's specific goals that have been set and impacts they're trying to achieve, so aligning on those and streamlining everybody's efforts to achieve a specific impact.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. I think eventually corporate social responsibility and the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN are going to merge together, and that a lot of what will come out of CSR will be related to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, I've just been clued in that we are running out of time. I'm delighted with this. I would love to spend another hour with this. But let me just thank the panel for sharing your brilliance, your research, your all the things that you've done, very, very much sharing it with us. We're going to make the audio of this available, and we're going to make the opportunities for corporate social responsibility at the summit and so forth will be available to people as well. I want to thank our panel for your magnificence. I want to thank all of the people who have tuned into this, and I also want to thank the co-sponsors, Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of Org Vitality, Dave Nershi, who is the Executive Director of SIOP, to Deborah Rupp from Purdue for all of the work that she's done, and to the National Science Foundation, which I hope will remain through the next 8 years, and for all the work that they've done. And I thank you very, very much. I hope I will have a chance to see you and to talk further with you when we go to SIOP to the session on the 26th. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.